Well, Alison, thank you very much, and thank you, friends, for that incredibly kind introduction. It's worth saying that the squeezed middle beat out both the Arab Spring and Bunga Bunga as the phrase of the year, which so was a particular achievement. Look, can I say it is great to be here at Progress. I want to thank Progress for the work that you do, the work you do challenging the old orthodoxies of the party, the work you do bringing new ideas to the party, including around the new centre ground, which you debated this morning, and also the way that you open up political space in the party for debate and discussion. And I think that is an incredibly important thing that you do, and it's particularly important now at the point that we are at. I also want to thank everybody in this room for the work that you did at the local elections 10 days ago and in that local election campaign. Be under no illusions. The reason we did as well as we did in those elections was because of the work of Labour Party members up and down this country. We had 1.9 million conversations on the doorstep between Labour Party members and members of the public from January to May to those elections. That was why we did as well as we did. That is why, and let's pay tribute to them today, we have 824 new councillors across this country. But as well as praising our work, in the tradition of Progress, we should also challenge ourselves. I don't know whether you've noticed, friends, but it's one of the sunniest days of the year. The shops are open. We're in the most exciting capital city in the world, and we've chosen to come here. And there are people, believe it or not, who are watching this speech on News 24. I'm talking about you. Let me tell you what you could be watching on the other channels. The qualifying rounds of the Spanish Grand Prix on BBC One. On ITV, you could be watching that 1962 classic, Carry On Cruising. And if you have Dave TV, you could be watching a rerun of Top Gear. That is sort of true all the time on Dave TV, but nevertheless. Now, look, why am I insulting my audience, the few people watching on News 24 and all of you? I want to make a serious point, which is the theme of my speech today, because it's about how politics is increasingly a minority activity, how it's practiced by fewer and fewer people. And you know, this government does have lessons to learn about the local election results. They do have lessons to learn, which I think they're failing to learn, about the people who voted Labour, the people who turned to us. But what I want to say today is we've got lessons to learn too. We've got lessons to learn about the fact that 2 out of every 3 people in this country did not vote at those local elections. The turnout lower than it's been for a decade. Now, it sometimes suits politicians to blame the voters for lack of interest, to say somehow it's their fault. Why don't people get involved anymore? That's not my position. That's not the view I take. I think people are telling us something we need to hear. Because yes, this is a government that has run out of ideas and is out of touch after only 2 years in office. But it tells us we have a long way to go to build the deep trust we need, to build the allegiance we need, and to build the enthusiasm we need. And it is a challenge we must rise to. And today I'm going to talk about how we do that. We have an opportunity, and we must seize that moment. I want the British people to understand how the Labour Party is changing, to understand the character of our party and how I think it can reach out to them. Now, our work to make that happen is well underway, but it must intensify, and that's my message today. For me, this change is about 4 things. It's first of all about showing how the Labour Party stands up for the people of Britain, not the powerful vested interests at the top, and I want to say something about that. It's about showing how politics can change our economy so it doesn't just work for a few people who are well off, but it works for everyone. It's about showing who we are as a party, that we reach into communities, we don't just talk to ourselves. And it's also about showing that we're a party that makes promises we can keep, not a party that makes promises that we won't keep. Let me say something about each of those things. Let me start by talking about politics and who it stands up for, because I think this is a central issue we now face in our country. Yesterday at the Leveson inquiry, we saw yet more evidence of the way this government has taken the side not of the public interest, but of Rupert Murdoch's interests. And what have we seen in the last few weeks? Because this is part of a pattern. A budget that cut taxes for millionaires while millions are forced to pay more. A cash for access scandal in which the Tory treasurer resigned over dinners for donors. A government which bent over backwards to help a large media company secure its biggest ever deal. And all the time, Britain's economy sliding into double-dip recession, a recession made in Downing Street, and still they refuse to change course. Now, what does this say about the government? For me, it says they're a government out of touch with the many and too close to the few. And the reason they've lost their way so badly in the last few weeks is not some accident, not some set of ministerial mess-ups. It's much deeper than that. It's about the revelation about who they really are, the character of the government, who they really stand for. So that's something about them. But what about us? I'm hugely proud of what Labour did in office. But having been in office for 13 years, let's be frank about this. The British public lost faith in who we stood for. We lost touch. We were too close to the powerful interests. What do I mean by that? We weren't willing to take on the banks until it was too late. We didn't do enough to take on the utilities as they drove up prices. We weren't willing enough to take on the media giants, though everyone knew that things weren't right. We became one of them rather than one of us. And we must put that right. The character of our party means we must always put the interests of the people of Britain ahead of unaccountable power wherever we find it. And we must do that even when it is difficult. We must do it even when conventional thinking and received wisdom says it's not what we should do. On phone hacking, I was slow to speak out, too slow to speak out. But when I did, there were some who warned me that by breaking the unwritten Westminster rule that you didn't speak out against the Murdochs, it would be a disaster for the Labour Party. The lesson I learned is that they were wrong, and we were right to speak out. We were right to speak out because it was the right thing to do. Earlier this year, we took a stand on Stephen Hester's bonus. Why? Not because one man's bonus was the biggest issue in politics, but because of what it said about the publicly owned banks and the way they were treating millions of people in this country, still handing out the large bonuses, still not providing the right service to the people of this country. Now, the Tories said it was anti-business. It wasn't. It was pro-business. It was about defending the small businesses who couldn't get a loan. The small businesses that I meet going around this country who say the banks are still not working for them. It was the right thing to do. And friends, it's the same with the big electricity companies or the train firms. They will not like being challenged. But in these tough times, people need to know where we stand and whose side we're on. And that's my first point. In the 20th century, our party pioneered the idea that our job was to stand up for workers against unaccountable private employers. That still matters. But in the 21st century also, we must be the party that stands up for consumers, for citizens, for small businesses, for workers against unaccountable private and public power. That must be the character of our party. It's something we forgot in government. It's something that must define us in the years ahead. Secondly, I want to talk about the economy, because I think this directly relates to the question of faith in the political system. You know, I think it's very interesting as a constituency MP, and walking around my constituency is when I get a chance to knock on doors like every other Labour Party member. And I think there's something that I notice and maybe you notice as well. The people who are more likely to be engaged in politics are those with families who rely on local services, who rely on maybe the local health service or the local school or the local services provided by the local authority. The people who are less, in my experience anyway, likely to be engaged in politics are those who don't have kids, who don't rely on local services, whose life is essentially defined partly by the work they do in the economy we have. And I think there's a lesson here for us. And the lesson is that lots of the people who we meet when we knock on those doors say, I'm not interested in you. I don't think you've got anything to say to me. Maybe you can raise my taxes a bit, maybe you can lower my taxes, although I think you're all going to raise my taxes, but that's what most people say to us on the doorstep. But in the end, my job isn't something that you can do anything about, that you can make a difference to. The type of opportunities that are available to me isn't something you can do anything about. That says something deep about our politics and the nature of our politics in the last 30 years. And I'm going to come to that in a second. I want to say something, though, also about an experience I had in the local election campaign in Redditch, because this goes directly to the point. And I talked to somebody there who said to me, look, I've watched our area lose our industry. He'd worked for a company that made trains for the tube. That company was no longer there. It was a proud British firm that no longer existed. And he said, look, I've watched our area. We've lost our industry, and there's nothing to replace it. And he talked about his son. And he said, look, he's a bright lad. I've got high hopes for him, but there's no job that I think is worthy of his talents. Now, the interesting thing is, he didn't blame the Tories. He didn't blame Labour. He blamed us all. He said, look, whoever's there, it's not going to be different. Now, I think we've got to stand up for people like that man and his son. That's who our party should be for. Our party must have something to say to him. And it can't just have something to say to him about the services we provide or the tax credits we provide, important though they are. It's got to have something to say about the kind of economy we're going to build for him and his son and people like him. And that's why at party conference, I challenged the old orthodoxy, the old story. The story that said globalization means we're powerless to affect the economy we have. And I tried to set out a different economy for Britain. An economy that creates good jobs with good wages and good training. An economy where we can get loans to businesses with bright ideas, even when the banks are refusing to lend. An economy sustained by a proper plan for jobs and growth, not just tax cuts for a few at the top, trickle-down economics. An economy that does not suck all of our talent away from companies that make things to the financial sector. A country that is interested in real engineering, not just financial engineering. And an economy that is not just sustained by low wages and cheap labour. Now that's what I mean when I talk about an economy that works for working people. And nobody should be in any doubt. That is the central mission of our party going forward. Just like in the 1990s, Tony Blair rightly said our central job was to rebuild our public services. So our defining mission has to be create a different sort of economy. An economy that doesn't just work for a few people at the top, but works for everyone. That is what we don't have in this country now. We didn't have it towards the end of our time in government, and we must create it to speak to the man in Redditch and the people I meet in my constituency and millions of people across this country who are disengaged from politics. So we must show who we stand up for. We must show the kind of economy we want to build. And we must show something about our party as well. That we're not some distant organisation, but that in every part of Britain, we are part of the community we seek to serve. Now, in the old days, it was said in the 1980s, some people here not old enough to remember that, in the 1980s, it was said we listened to the party membership, but not the public. Then it was said we listened to the public, but not the party. The reality is that by the end of our time in government, I think we'd stop listening to both. So what happens to you in government? On 10p tax, on the pace of immigration, on the loss of trust over Iraq, on excessive rewards for excessive risks at the top. Party members were actually getting these concerns, but the leadership wasn't listening enough. So we need a leadership connected to the party. But we also need a party connected to the public. You know, I went to Bradford West a couple of weeks after we lost the by-election. And when I do media interviews, when I talk to audiences like this, I'm the one that raises Bradford West. And I think it's right we talk about it. Not just because of the need to connect properly to the Muslim community in Bradford and elsewhere, but because of the wider reason that we'd lost touch with parts of that community. And that's not just true in Bradford West. It's true in other parts of the country as well. People who feel beyond the reach of the Labour Party. And that's what we've got to do. We've got to make sure that we reach further and deeper into every community in Britain. The question is how to do it. And there are fantastic experiences all around this country, all around this room, all around this party about what we can do. I just want to give a couple of examples. I want to start in Battersea. I want to tell you a story about what's been happening in Battersea. Battersea, obviously not a Labour seat. When the Labour Party in Battersea organised their first meeting after the 2010 election, only 2 people turned up. Andy Fearn and Mark Roney. I don't know whether they're here or not. They're obviously out canvassing. Now, they started canvassing as usual, but halfway through, they felt a bit demoralised and went to the pub. They didn't just have a drink at the pub, because they're Labour Party members. They said, look, how do we re-engage people with our party? And what they decided to do is something very simple. They said, look, let's phone all of our new members. Let's speak to all of the people who've been members for a long time and say, what are you interested in doing in this party? Why did you join the party? Why did you join the party in the first place? Or why did you join the party as a new member? And you know, it doesn't sound like rocket science, but frankly, it's what lots of parties don't do. People join the party and then are sort of forgotten about. And we wonder why people don't stay with us. It's a basic lesson of any voluntary organisation in the country that you talk to your members and talk about what they want to do. And the Battersea story is interesting also because of what it teaches us about the kind of party we need to be. Mark and Andy are rebuilding the Labour Party in Battersea, but they're rebuilding it essentially as a community organisation. One of the biggest issues was around charges for the local playground. That's what they found when they talked to people, and that's what they're campaigning on. And they've had more people coming to meetings, not just to sit in meetings, but to actually make a difference to the local community. The reality is that we've got to make that happen, not in Battersea, but in every part of the United Kingdom. And I want to say something very clear to you today. We now have a General Secretary, we now have a Labour Party organisation that is as dedicated to this as the people in this room. And I think that is very, very important. Because we've got to show how we can change lives even while we're in opposition. That is one of the ways we rebuild faith in politics. And I want to single out Labour students for the work they're doing on this. Labour students is campaigning around the country in a campaign where they're working with my brother around the living wage. An incredibly important campaign. A campaign that shows we can bring justice to the workplace and that we care not just about ourselves, but the people we came into politics to represent. And we're already succeeding. And it's not just Labour students who are doing it. Many of our MPs are doing it, and I'm going to single out some, but lots of our MPs are doing it. Luciana Berger in Liverpool is campaigning around policing on the streets. Siobhan McDonough has organised her own jobs fair in Mitcham and Morden to say, look, I'm going to get people in Mitcham and Morden back to work, even if this government is not going to do so. Stella Creasy is campaigning not just in Walthamstow on payday loans, but right across the country. That is the kind of party we've got to be. Not just knocking on doors at election time saying, please vote for us, but the party that says we can change our country. And why are we so strengthened in doing that? Because of the Labour local authorities that we now run. And I just want to say something very clear about that, which is the work those Labour local authorities do will form the basis of the next Labour manifesto. Because too often we haven't taken seriously enough what local government does and the difference it makes in communities up and down this country. But friends, let's be frank about this. We're only just beginning to change the culture of the party. I want to say this very clearly. I take responsibility for this. We have a long way to go to make that culture change happen. We're knocking on doors we haven't knocked on for years. That's one of the lessons of the local election campaign. I want to say something, though, about voter registration, because this concerns the way we knock on doors and whose doors we knock on. And there'll be lots of people in this room who think, I've just got my party to get to the stage where they knock on the doors of the people who voted in previous elections, and now the leader's going to come along and say, we've got to do it differently. And I just want to say something about this. Look, if we only knock on the doors of people who vote, we're not going to reach the 2/3 of people who didn't vote at the last local elections. Now, it's incredibly tough, as I know from my own experience in my own constituency, because you need to grow the number of people who are actually out there for Labour before you can actually go beyond the people who are actually voters. But if we're going to re-engage people, if we're actually going to reach out to those people, we've got to knock on more doors, not just the doors of those who vote at the moment, never mind those who vote Labour. And there's a particular reason why we need to do this. A little noticed part of the Queen's speech was individual voter registration. Now, individual voter registration is not coming in till after the next general election. But all of the people who are postal voters on the current plans are going to be taken off the register as postal voters and will have to reapply to be postal voters before the next election. That means a massive task for us as a party. Now, whatever happens to that bill in Parliament, we've got to make registering people and getting people on the register, because there are as many as 6 million people who may be threatened to be off the register. We've got to make sure that voter registration becomes a central part of what local Labour parties do. And I want to commit today that our party will embark on the biggest drive we've seen in a generation to register new voters. Everyone should be on the register who is eligible to vote. And that is our task as a party committed to every person in this country. And let's set ourselves an objective. 1997 was an election that delivered big positive change for Britain. And it had certainly a higher turnout than the elections that came afterwards. Let's get voter turnout back to those 1997 levels. Let's make 2015 a change election, not just with the election of a Labour government, but people turning out to vote, and it's our responsibility as a party. But final thing I want to say is this. If we're going to change things, we must show that we are different from what people expect from politicians. Look, I just want to say a small thing about what I tried to do last Friday. Politicians are expected to go on a victory lap when they win local elections. But the reality about the local elections is they said, we've done well, but we have a lot further to go. That's why I went to Worcester, where we hadn't taken control of the council. And what I've said to my colleagues is, in everything we do, we've got to understand what people think of politics, what people think of politicians, and try and do the opposite. And one of those things is about the way we make promises and the promises that we break. Look, there's no question that the government has catastrophically forfeited trust in itself by breaking promises on everything from child benefit to educational maintenance allowances to the NHS to we're all in it together. You could give me a long list and we'd be here all afternoon and you wouldn't be home in time for Top Gear. But here's the thing. It doesn't just damage them, it damages us all. That is the reality. Because it makes people think you're all the same. And I always go around and say this to people. We've got to be the first party in history to underpromise and overdeliver, not overpromise and underdeliver. I know how tempting it is as a leader in opposition. And David Cameron fell for every temptation there was to make promises to people, because people say to you, please say you'll restore the educational maintenance allowance. And you think, well, I'd certainly like to do that. You know, please say you'll restore this cut or that cut. We will only make promises we can keep. But it's the right thing to do, but it's also because it's the only thing to do to restore trust in politics. But here's the test of us. Here's the test of us. Only make promises you can keep. But don't just look like a different management of the system. Don't just look like the establishment in waiting, the government in exile, the people waiting for another turn of the wheel so we can get our turn back, the people who say, let's just carry on where we left off in government. If we do that, we won't win and we won't deserve to win. Because the challenges now are different. Because we know we made mistakes. And we've got to be the people who say, look, actually, we have a different vision, not just from this government, but from the last Labour government as well. Not because we're not proud of what we did, but because we know the times are different, the challenges are different, and we've learned lessons. Now, what is that vision? I'm very clear about what it is. Above all, for me, it's about a country that is no longer riven in the way it is by class, income, and wealth. That's why I came into the Labour Party. That's what scars our country. That's what holds back opportunity in this country. That's what we stand for as a party. That's what it says in the new Clause 4. We've got to be a country where, above all, the economy works for all the working people in it, not just a few people at the top. And yes, it's part of our task too, to show that politics can improve people's lives, to restore faith in politics. So we have to be a party that makes realistic promises, but has big ideals for a different way of us living together. Now, friends, I think we now have the opportunity to make that happen. The reality is that after last Thursday in particular, people are listening to us once again. Let's show them that we are worthy of their trust. Let's all play our part in making that happen. Thank you very much.